This is the Speaking of Writers podcast. I'm Steve Richards. The book is Buckley, The Life and the Revolution That Changed America, the author Sam Tanenhaus. The definitive biography of William F. Buckley Jr., written by Sam Tanenhaus. This monumental work, more than 2 decades in the making, tells the compelling story of America's greatest conservative and the rise and fall of the movement he led. Buckley vividly captures its subject in all its facets and phases, offering an authoritative account of an American giant and the world he made. Sam Tanenhaus, the former editor of the New York Times Book Review, is the author of the national bestseller, Whittaker Chambers, a biography, winner of the Los Angeles Times Book Prize and finalist for both the National Book Award and the Pulitzer Prize. His feature articles and essays have appeared in The Atlantic, New Yorker, New York Times Magazine, Vanity Fair, and many other publications in the U.S. and abroad. He is currently a contributing writer for the Washington Post. I am happy to have, for the first time, Sam Tanenhaus join me here on the Speaking of Writers podcast. Welcome.
Oh, good to be here, Steve.
So, Sam, what first drew you to William F. Buckley Jr. as a subject worthy of such a majestic, comprehensive biography?
Well, I got to know him when I was working on a previous book when I was a very young guy and nobody from nowhere. I'm not an old guy who's nobody from nowhere, but at that point I was in my early 30s, and I was interested in writing a biography of Whittaker Chambers, a really unusual figure in the Cold War, who'd been the accuser of Alger Hiss in the famous perjury/spy trial that kind of gave us the McCarthy period, just to put it in a nutshell. And Buckley, who was much younger than Chambers died in 1961 at the age of 60. The very young William Buckley had become both a kind of protege or disciple of Chambers, the anti-communist, and also a sponsor, because Buckley was a young rich guy. And Chambers was at the end of his life, and he was living in a kind of exile. And Buckley was the one I knew from my research into Chambers' life who had kind of revived him as a person, given him some importance again, brought him onto his magazine, National Review. The two of them exchanged these quite wonderful letters. And I knew if I was going to tell the story of Chambers, I would need the help, or at least some kind of tacit approval, from Buckley. And Buckley, you'll remember, Steve, he was really famous back then. We were talking about like 1990, and you could not be a more famous public intellectual, in that term I guess people still use, it's kind of an odd one, but there you have it. Then Bill Buckley. People knew him on the street from his television program, Firing Line. If Bill Buckley walked into a restaurant, everybody knew who he was. He was super famous, and yet he was so nice to me. Not nice in the way of a great man deigning to let some scruffy nobody into the margins of his life. He treated me as if I was somebody of consequence. And I thought, I've never seen this before. And I'll tell you, Steve, I know you're a big music person. The only other person I've met who had that same graciousness was the great Linda Ronstadt. When I wrote a profile of her for the New York Times many years later, when I was working at the Times, had this way of making you feel like you're somebody, not just a hanger-on, not just a piece of the furniture. So I thought, this is the next guy I want to write about when I finish Chambers. So that was early on in the 90s, as I was getting to know Buckley, who was then at the peak of his career and beginning really to retreat a little bit. His great battles had been won. His guy, Ronald Reagan, had been elected. The Soviet Union had fallen. So this is the guy whose story I want to tell. And Buckley liked the Chambers book enough to say, okay, go ahead and do it. I'll let you see all my papers. You can talk to anybody you want. And then, of course, while writing the book through all these years, I found out things, he probably had no idea I would uncover, things he didn't even know about his family and his background. And there you have this big, big book. Although I really want listeners to understand, it is written to be read. This, it's got a lot of footnotes in it, but it's written to be read. It's a story. And Buckley himself lived his life in so full a way. Sailor, skier, spy novelist, TV personality, Manhattan celebrity, that I wanted to try to capture that as well as I could.
So he died in 2008, so 10 years before his death. That's when he chose you to write this book. Was it a letter that came in the mail one day, a phone call that says, Sam, I want you to do
You're the
this?
first person to ask how it actually happened. It went like this. Bill Buckley is a son, Christopher Buckley, who's a
Yep.
really good writer. In fact, a better writer than his father, though Bill Buckley was a good writer too. And Christopher Buckley was very taken with the biography because he liked the literary quality in it. I really try to tell stories. And Buckley was that way too. So I got to know Christopher, who had liked the Chambers biography when it was published in 1997. And we had lunch. And he said, what are you thinking about next? And I said, well, your father's pretty interesting, big guy too. And he said, well, why don't you do it? And I said, well, I'm not a member of the conservative movement. I'm not a guy who writes for National Review, his famous magazine, still with us, right? Most influential political magazine, one could argue, modern history. And Christopher said, you're a storyteller, so do it. And he said, I'll talk to Pop. That's how he called his father. Listeners will know from the great memoir Christopher wrote called Losing Mom and Pop about his parents. And Bill Buckley said, sure. He said, there are a lot of ideologues who can tell the history of the movement or make the case for Buckley. That's not what he wanted. He wanted the big life. So we had lunch. It's the only time I ever invited Bill Buckley to lunch. And he got lost driving there. I was living in Tarrytown in Westchester County, New York. And the highways can be pretty tricky. He drove himself from Stanford, where he had his weekend home. And we met at a restaurant. I can't believe I'm telling you this. I've never told anybody this before. Met at a restaurant, and he said, okay, you can do it. He said, I think you'll tell the story. Right? And he knew, listen, Bill Buckley is not a guy who wrote a classic defensive conservatism that will be read through the ages like his friend Russell Kirk. He's not a thinker and philosopher like his protege Gary Wills or the columnist George Wills. He's not that kind of guy, George Will. He's not that kind of guy. He needs somebody who gets him in the round. He said, I think you'll do it. He said, you'll write a portrait. So I said, go ahead. Whatever help you need, I will give you. So that was in 97. And so we began with many, many interviews. Those days, you still did them on cassettes. You tape them on those miniature discs, which I still have. And then he just let his very wide, large orbit, including his family. The guy was the sixth of 10 siblings, right? So there are a lot of Buckleys out there. He said, this is the guy who's doing it. Talk to him, and just whatever help he could be, he could give me. He did, and there it began.
So you got entree to his intimate circle, unrestricted access to his most private papers. Sam, how, if it did your perception of Buckley change over the course of doing that research and the interviews?
Great question, because Buckley, the person, remained, and it still does in my eyes, as one of the largest, most generous, capacious people I ever met. But Buckley, the political performer and movement leader, turned out to be more complicated than I realized, because he was coming onto the scene from the time of the publication of his first book, God and Man at Yale, in 1951. When he's 25 years old, he becomes a national celebrity. He was bringing a lot of different people into the tent to build a conservative movement at the height of what was then the liberal consensus in America. So that meant he's palling around with all sorts of people you don't expect. Joe McCarthy, Roy Cohn. Now, some of this I knew in a kind of abstract way, but the big surprise, Steve, was not in the papers he invited me to look at, but that his son Christopher said I might find useful in the Buckley family's second home. Bill Buckley grew up in the northwest corner of Connecticut, it's called. Beautiful part of the state where I now live, right across the state line from Dutchess County, and just below the state line from the Berkshires
Yeah.
and Western Massachusetts. Beautiful area of the country. And that's where Bill Buckley was raised in the 1930s and 40s. But his family had a second home. His father was a real estate dealer, speculator, and oil speculator who made and lost fortune first in Mexico and then in Venezuela. So Latin American oil in the early years of the 20th century. But Buckley's father, William F. Buckley Sr., and Bill Buckley's mother, Aloise Steiner Buckley, were both from the South. His father was from deep Texas, South Texas. He was from Duval County, which history nerds will know was the county that gave Senator Lyndon Johnson his, quote, landslide, unquote, victory in 1948, which was a stolen election. So that's one reason Bill Buckley was a little distrustful of elections, as some other people in our politics are today. And his mother was from New Orleans. So they were Southerners. They called themselves culturally Southern. And the Buckleys, Bill Buckley and his 9 siblings, spent their winters in this magnificent antebellum mansion in Camden, South Carolina. And when I went down there with my wife, it's now a ramshackle. It's like Gone with the Wind when you see it now. You know, the house has fallen apart. The grounds are overrun. But we went down and looked at the archive there, because when you do my kind of work, you depend a lot on old newspapers. What I write is history, but it's closer almost to journalism. If you think of writers like David Halberstam is another one, or Rick Perlstein do this. You go through a lot of old newspapers to capture the moment of the time you're writing about, because you've got these great on-the-scene reporters who are describing what they see, events in real time, just the way we read journalism today. So I went down to South Carolina because I wanted to see what that scene was like, the old Buckley scene when he was being raised there. And also there was a single tantalizing reference in National Review, the magazine Buckley edited, founded first a weekly, then what they used to call, great phrase, a fortnightly, came out every 2 weeks. During the peak of the civil rights movement in the 1950s, there was a single lone reference to a violent episode in Camden, South Carolina. Unsigned editorial. Well, I had access to what are called the master volumes of the magazine in their New York office. And all the editorials, unsigned ones, have initials in red pencil indicating who wrote them. And I knew, logically, I could have figured it out anyway, that it was Bill Buckley, who else was going to do it, who writes this little tantalizing editorial about violence, racial violence in Camden, South Carolina. So I thought, okay, go down to the library. They'll have old copies of the newspaper, local newspaper there called the Camden Chronicle on microfilm, and I'll read through it. The archivist says, yeah, we have the Camden Chronicle, but I assume you want to read the other newspaper. The other newspaper? The one the Buckley family owned. Owned? The Camden News. The Chronicle came out twice a week. It had been around forever. The Camden News came out once a week and began publication in 1956, right after the Brown decision, right, desegregating schools, and what was called massive resistance in the South. An aspect of that history a lot of us don't know or forgot, I had to learn about it, that's why these books are interesting, was the organized resistance to the Supreme Court's ruling. Those of you who think you're seeing it for the first time under President Trump, I've got news for you. 119 nationally elected legislators in the House and the Senate combined vowed to use any means they could, short of violence, to stop the Brown decision from being implemented. And of course, sometimes it did spill over into violence, and we've all heard of the Ku Klux Klan. But there was a second group called the White Citizens Councils, called the Uptown Klan. They had button-down shirts and neckties. They belonged to the Chamber of Commerce. They did not go around in hoods with Kliegels and burning torches. Instead, they said, well, I see you made a donation to the NAACP. We don't really like them down here. I think you're going to have a little trouble getting that loan from your bank unless you reconsider. Yeah. So that's the Citizens Council. The second newspaper owned by the Buckleys was created to support the White Citizens Council. And I had no idea. No Buckley ever talked about it in their lifetimes. But when you went down to South Carolina, saw the newspaper, read the local press in other cities, which praised the Buckleys for putting out this newspaper, and learned that Bill Buckley's sister, Priscilla, one of the best editors of her time, edited Joan Didion in the pages of National Review, was editing this newspaper at the same time in the South. And I said, okay, this story is a little different now. It doesn't make Bill Buckley a different person face to face, but it gives him a different place in our history. And then I found all this in 2016. Well, by that point, Steve, the conservative movement and the Republican Party are starting to look a little different. It doesn't feel like Ronald Reagan's party so much anymore. Or are there things about Ronald Reagan's party we never really understood, or Bill Buckley's party? And then the story starts taking on a different dimension. I must add, Buckley came around on this. And if you look at his great program, Firing Line, you will see a fantastic interview he did a dozen years after all this with Muhammad Ali. You will see the leaders of the Black Panther Party, being interviewed by Buckley on Firing Line. That's what made him fascinating, the way he would change and evolve and rethink things. Once he looked at you, once he met you and heard you talk, because he was a great listener, Buckley. He was famous for his speech, was mimicked by everybody, the impersonators from David Fry to Robin Williams. Everybody did their Bill Buckley back in the day. But he was a great listener. And once he got to know you and heard what you had to say, then the wheels would start turning. That's why Firing Line was such a great show. And why Buckley, yes, he's kind of dented by this history, but I also saw how he overcame it. And so there was, so it enlarged him, even as it had diminished him, if that makes any kind of sense.
Now, Sam, Buckley was both a political intellectual, and you're talking about media too, and a media figure. How did you approach balancing these sides in the narrative?
That's really hard to do. It was the single hardest problem I had. I can see you've talked to a lot of writers because you get right at these issues. How do you tell the story in a way that's narrative and consecutive? But, you think of Buckley, just as you said, he has many facets. It's like a Picasso portrait where you see three noses because each nose is seen from a different angle. How do you do it? And so I spent a lot of time not just going through documents and talking to people and reading old newspapers, but also trying to solve the storytelling problem. Where do certain stories belong? Well, one of the things you find in a narrative like this, and I learned it from the masters, right? You've talked to a lot of writers, and every one of them will tell you there are lots of great writers they learn from. In this case, someone I learned a lot from was someone I'm proud to have gotten to know, Robert Caro, the Lyndon Johnson biographer, because what I saw he did in his books was he made each volume in the series a kind of moral drama about Lyndon Johnson. So as we know, the books are called The Years of Lyndon Johnson. And instead of just telling the straight story beginning to end, you see Johnson at a key moment in the Senate campaign I mentioned before, or when he's passing the first civil rights bill, which National Review vehemently opposed in 1957, or when he's vice president. You're seeing him captured at that moment. That's what I tried to do on, it sounds comical, smaller scale, because a book is 850 manuscript text pages in addition to the notes and apart from the notes in the index. So I tried to tell it through these episodes, big episodes that would capture Buckley in motion, doing different things, sometimes overlapping. You pull out a story and tell it in a different place, and it's up to me as a storyteller to make sure the reader is following it, while at the same time mapping Buckley's life over the rise of the conservative movement he led. Because for the reader to feel the historic significance of Buckley, not just that he's a charming, fascinating, brilliant person, as you said, media personality, basically invented modern conservative media out of his own head. Radio, television, magazines, columns, public debates, all the stuff we're used to now. If there had been a Twitter in Buckley's day, he would have been better at it than Elon Musk, because it was so fast, so quick. The words came to him so easily. So he's doing all this, but he's doing it for a purpose. And it's the rise and fall of the movement that give the overall structure to the story. So you're starting with conservatives at the beginning. They're kind of groping in the dark, living almost underground in a way, and then emerging to higher and higher visibility and power and influence. And you can map that against the rise of Bill Buckley. So that's how I did it. Took a long time to do it, but that's how it worked.
And Sam, speaking of the movement, the conservative movement, and I'm sure you've been asked this a lot, how do you think Buckley would interpret today's conservative movement?
It's the great unknowable question. And it does get asked all the time. And you can look at a quite brilliantly written analytical piece on the Trump administration by the great Peter Baker that was published on Sunday, their chief White House correspondent. And you'll see he asks me the same question. How do we attach, how do we connect Buckley to Trump? And the answer is really many layered. One way to understand it is to see the movement as one born in opposition, right? Buckley creates his movement in a period, the 50s and 60s, that we call the consensus, but we really mean the liberal consensus. It's the New Frontier of Jack Kennedy. It's the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson. So the conservative movement is there to say, stop. You're going too far. We will make our peace with a New Deal. We don't love it, but we accept that it's here. But really, the Great Society, we'll accept that we're not going to exclude people of color from the Ivy League, but really affirmative action. So it's always pushing back against what seems to be liberal progress or predations in their view. Well, you can look at Donald Trump now and say, what do he and his supporters say? That they're at war against a woke establishment in campuses. Buckley's first target was his own alma mater, Yale, kind of like J.D. Vance today, the Yale man who's turned against it, or Ted Cruz, who turns against Princeton, or Josh Hawley, who turns against Yale. Somebody said to me, all these people seem to come through Yale, beginning with Buckley. Yeah. So in that sense, as an oppositional movement, yeah, I could see where Buckley would say, okay, this guy really means to undo those big social programs. I might be good with that. But then if you said to Bill Buckley, well, they're also going to stop vaccinating people against measles, I think he might say, maybe we're going a little far here. How much do we want to roll it back? I think that's the question Buckley would be asking now. And another thing, Steve, that is just shot through in this exchange we're having. Buckley was so smart and erudite and learned. He loved the English language, right? He used words that I'm still looking up in the dictionary. One of his favorite books was actually 20 plus books, the Oxford English Dictionary. I've got the 2 small volumes. You read with magnifying glass. I got through the Book of the Month Club many years ago when I was a college student. Bill Buckley had the full volumes. And once when he was not in his huge office, I picked one up and flipped through it. And my God, he's actually reading this thing. And that's what he sounded like and wrote like. So is Bill Buckley going to be comfortable with the kind of the coarseness, the language we hear now, the vituperation? Yeah, he did a little bit of it himself. You can see the famous notorious exchange with Gore Vidal, which Buckley never lived down, was embarrassed about to the end of his life. But for the most part, he was a man of a kind of capacious intellect, and you think, that might be a bit of a problem for him.
As my father would say, history and English teacher, great command of the language.
Yes, extraordinary. He knew what words meant. Because I'd find myself looking at a word, I think, well, maybe he's misused it, or maybe he just wants the extra syllables in there. And then you go through the third definition in the Oxford English Dictionary. No, the word is used in that way. But one reason for that, it's a great paradox about Buckley, is that his first language was Spanish. He was raised by Mexican servants, and his mother was constantly giving birth and recovering from childbirth and nursing children. And the father was traveling the globe looking for backers for the oil company. So the kids were raised by servants. And Bill didn't really speak English well till he was 8 or 9 years old. In addition, they lived abroad for 4 years. They lived in Europe. It's funny because Bill Buckley's first movement was the America First movement, but he spent some of his formative years in Europe. Well, you could also say Charles Lindbergh was the greatest figure in the isolationist movement. He sewed the hemispheres together in his flight across the Atlantic. So there are these paradoxes we see all the time in politics. One reason it's fun to write about. But Buckley did have an extraordinary command of the language. He was not the best writer in the conservative movement, though he was one of them. He was certainly not the best thinker, but he was the most articulate defender and champion of the positions. And as somebody who understood with a kind of preternatural, intuitive grasp for where the culture was, Buckley at a very early age got that politics was going to be driven by media. It's partly because his first idol, Lindbergh, was denounced in the media. So Buckley saw, okay, that's how powerful the media is. When he was at Yale in 1947 and 8, he tried to buy a big radio program that was broadcast through the state. Was on the verge of buying it. The guy wanted to sell it to Buckley and his father, but the finances were so shaky, Buckley's father and son withdrew. But that means that Buckley, at about the age of 21, would not only have been writing a daily column for the Yale Daily News, he would have owned a political radio program broadcast in the 7 biggest cities in Connecticut. And this guy isn't even out of college yet. That's how ambitious he was, and how well he understood where things were going. Variety magazine, the great film industry magazine, called him the conservative man for all media, because he was everywhere, newspapers, television, all this. And he never talked down to his audience. That was the genius of Buckley. If you see him, you can go on YouTube and see the great interviews. I was just looking at his interview with Groucho Marx, and here he is treating Groucho Marx, who was his friend, as if he's this kind of sage, and Buckley's just listening to him. Or Germaine Greer, the great feminist. Buckley and Greer really hit it off. And they go back and forth, and they trade witticisms, and it's about kind of, getting the last word. It's winning through debate and argument. It's outwitting the other person. And it feels very kind of archaic on the one hand, but also there's something very reassuring, and it gives you a kind of pang. You think, well, why don't people talk that way anymore?
Yeah, he was a great listener. What an extraordinary life. And this is a fantastic book, Buckley, The Life and the Revolution That Changed America, the author, Sam Tanenhaus. Sam, I could talk to you for hours about Buckley, as I'm sure you could, of course. But thank you for joining me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Really enjoyed it, Steve.
Thank you. And this is the Speaking of Writers podcast. Thank you for watching. I'm Steve Richards.